Yeah, we're coming up on 7 o'clock, so we're glad that you're here tonight. We're in our study here on how we got the Bible. Okay, and we're in the Middle Ages tonight. So this is going to be exciting. Okay, and so we're in lesson 7. We're going to be talking about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the Reformation, some cool stuff there. And then we'll probably get into the Bible into English and really getting some interesting things that hopefully you'll find enlightening. So as we go through the Middle Ages, let's talk about the Middle Ages a little bit. The Middle Ages it's a unique period of time. It began around 476 AD when the Visigoths came down and they took over Rome, and ended around the 14th century, which was the beginning of the Renaissance period. And they've also been known as the medieval period or the Dark Ages. And really, the term Middle Ages or the Dark Ages is something that, it's like the victor always gets to name that tune. And so it was the folks in the Renaissance era that they're looking around at themselves, all proud of themselves, at their things that they were accomplishing and thinking, man, my grandpa and great-grandpa and all those folks, they weren't too sharp, They didn't come up with much. They didn't have any good leadership. They didn't have any great art or anything. Look at us. And so that's kind of where the Dark Ages kind of came into thought. But there was a lot going on during that period of time. And so don't be fooled by, a little bit of a prejudicial view from the Renaissance folks who gave it their name. So let's go ahead and name some factors that contributed to making the Middle Ages into this period that's also called the Dark Ages. And then we want to take a look at some of the results of these factors. So there were 3 in particular that Kyle came up with in the book. What was probably the first and maybe the most dramatic of the factors that came out of the Middle Ages? The barbarian invasions of Europe. Yeah. Oh man. What was a barbarian back then? Why'd they call somebody a barbarian? You know where that term came from? I think Tommy's talking about it.
It's a language thing, a barbarian language.
Well, part of it was associated with that for sure. They kind of thought of these other languages as kind of mumbling kind of things, but basically think of it as anybody that wasn't a cultured Roman was a barbarian. It's sort of like the Jews. The Jews got to name the Gentiles. The Gentiles didn't name the Jews. It was it was part of that thing there that when you split up groups. So what was some of the results of the barbarian invasions? What generally happened when the Huns came rolling through from Asia and they just started kicking out everybody in front of them, and these were pretty tough folks that they were kicking out, but because the Romans had trouble with them, the Goths and all of those folks up there in Germany and around that area, and in the Slavic areas, but they're booting all these folks out, and so you got to go somewhere, all right? And so across the border they come and they start finding out the Romans had lost a little in the translation over the years, and so. So what basically was the result of barbarian invasions? Well, a lot of things got shaken up in the cultures that were going on. So besides the fact of cities being wrecked and torn down and burned, and it's like they'd pick up a book and use it as toilet paper, kind of thing, because they don't know what a book is, and just those kinds of things. So it was a period where if there's no stability, there's no peace. If there's no peace, people don't have time to think. All they're thinking about is, am I going to live to the next meal? Let alone, am I going to raise my child, or something like that. So that was the first thing. All right, what was another one? What happened when these guys came rolling through? What were they used to? What were the people of Europe used to? Did you say authority? Okay, I heard the E. Yeah, the central Rome, right? I mean, Rome was everywhere. The roads, the postal service, the the signs on the side of the road. I mean, everything was organized, and you had all these names for that we use today for the counties and all those kinds of things. Those all came out of Rome. The organizations were all out of Rome. And so you had this loss of central authority. And so what would that cause? Or what did it cause? And what's the most popular thing about the Middle Ages that you see all the time as far as organization of government? What do you see? Okay, I heard the feudal system. Yeah, knights and the ruler of the manor, and he hires the serfs out there, and everything was very splintered up towards that. So, and once all of that is decentralized, it became very easy. The guy that had the most money had the most armor. The guy that had the most armor had the most power. And so the guy that had the most power then could do whatever they wanted. And this is where you got the might makes right kind of thing, back to the animalistic, the survival of the fittest. So then the third one was this dominance of the Roman Catholic Church. Now what was the problem? What was that? What was being caused by that? Now we know there was a big leadership gap, right? From a political standpoint, everybody was kind of doing their own thing. Well, how did the Roman Catholic Church fill that gap?
Attitude toward science, investigation, and learning left ignorance in their
Okay, basically all of these things associated with what Shirley was talking about, it led to basically the people being very, very ignorant and afraid and superstitious, and all of this was because they were just in the dark. The Roman Catholic Church ran everything. They stepped in where the politics of the day were no longer around, and so as a result, they were the only centralized authority was out there. And so the religion took on a different kind of a feel during that. Have you ever seen the Three Musketeers movie, and Cardinal Richelieu, the evil Catholic cardinal and everything who was running the government? It was that kind of a situation through there. So the Roman Catholic Church was dominating everything. They were dominating the kings, because the kings were all split up into a bunch of little areas just fighting each other too. So that was a problem. Latin was not the common language of the people anymore. What happened to Latin? I thought Rome was everywhere. Roman citizens were everywhere. They spoke Latin. What happened to Latin? They all got C's and nobody passed. Well, remember what happened with as the Huns came through and kicked out the Goths kicked out the Romans. Now people are replacing each other. Remember what happened with the Assyrians, and when they moved into the northern Israel, and they brought in people from all over the place, and they all spoke different languages, and they replaced the people that were there and interbred with the ones that were left, and they called them Samaritans. Okay, well, that was happening everywhere in Europe, everywhere. And so there was a real problem here with the fact that Latin was not, there was no common language anymore. And so step in the Catholic Church again. You got the Latin Vulgate became the only authorized version of the Bible, because it was the Catholic authorized version of the Bible. There was no other. And basically preaching was done all in Latin, because the Catholic Church said it was going to be done in Latin. And so it was. That was the only preaching. Didn't matter whether you spoke Latin or not. You were going to get it in Latin. And the result was you had an illiterate people. Yeah, that's why part of the reason they called it the Dark Ages, because people just were not, getting the kind of education and things as before. But all of these things were part of that. So this is setting the table, though, for what's for what's coming up, and it's kind of, maybe you want to think about it as this is the tilling the ground a little bit, just getting it ready for the seed. Okay, so let's go to this next question. Why were Bibles chained down in the Middle Ages? This is a picture of the Bible that was in the church where Martin Luther worked. And you can see the chains on the Bible. Yeah, they were pricey. Exactly. Yeah, very expensive. Think about the paper itself. What was being used for paper back in 950, in 800? What was being used for paper? Parchment. What was parchment? Yeah, animal skins, right? So you got the first books are coming out in parchments and things like that, and there's no printing press, there's no Xerox copiers, there's no any of that. That's why these Bibles became basically works of art, because not only were the scribes inscribing the words, but then they would put the flourishes on it. And and if you've ever seen any of these in museums, they're just absolutely gorgeous. So very expensive. They were works of art, basically. And let's just face it, the common people were not encouraged to learn Latin so that they could read what was in the Bible. Just weren't. The only people that were allowed to do that were the clergy. And the word allowed is what we're talking about here. It wasn't that, I'm illiterate, so I'm not going to go read the Bible today. I mean, this was literally policy from the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, think of it as a separate political organization that was running parallel to all of the government organizations at the time. Even as the governments got bigger, the Catholic Church continued to grow in power and strength. Okay, so what two problems from the Old Testament did the people of the Middle Ages also suffer from? Well, on all these examples we just talked about, okay, lack of knowledge was one thing, right? Remember from Hosea 4, verse 6? My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Yeah, lack of knowledge for many different reasons. Most of them official reasons, purposeful reasons. And the second one was with the policies of the Catholic Church, what was being done as far as the interaction between the Word of God and the common people? Was being suppressed, exactly, yes. So again, like Jesus in Matthew chapter 23, verse 13, and his criticism of the Jewish leadership, where they should have been making it available in the Word of God. Instead, they were literally shutting it off from any access there. Jesse?
So another passage in the Old Testament to go along with maybe the Hosea one is what is recorded in Amos 8, 11 and 12. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord God, that I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread, nor thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. They shall wander from sea to sea, and from north to east they shall run to and fro, seeking the word of the Lord, but shall not find it. So there certainly was a great famine or drought during this time of God's word and access to it, knowledge of it. Something else I think is ironic and sad. Here we are all these years removed from what we're saying about the Roman Catholic Church and how just the clergy would have really access to it, and they really didn't want the common man reading it. And I know there's exceptions to it, so this is not a blanket statement, but it is still, I think, a general truth or reality of what I've run into and experienced through the years is many of our Roman Catholic neighbors still don't know God's word, and they depend a lot on their clergy, on their priests to to tell them. And there's exceptions of those who are actually reading their Bibles or have Bible study groups, but I think that's more rare than common.
Well, you think about even people we ran into in denominational folks who, if you got a Bible question, you want to run to your preacher, in most cases their pastor, to get the answer because they don't know what the answer is. If you were like, one of the things we got to look at just recently was my mom and dad's family Bible, and my sister has it. And I remember it sitting on the coffee table in the living room in a wooden case that said Holy Bible on it, and never opened. And when you open it now, it just cracks because it was never, ever, ever opened. It was God's holy word. You couldn't open it, and so it was very, very different kind of time that we live in today, but yet some are not so different. So, again, something to be aware of. Let's go on and talk about the Renaissance and the Reformation. Then, the Renaissance it's just a French word, Renaissance, and it just means rebirth. And it was a revival. It was a going back to the classical Greek artistry back pre-Roman, basically, as far back as that. Now, we know the Romans were great imitators, and they imitated the Greeks. And so for a long time, the Greek culture just kept on kind of expanding and modifying and everything through that. And so this was an attempt to jump back over 1,000 years, this 1,000-year gap, jump over that back to the time of the Romans and the Greeks, and to go back, and especially the classical humanist Greek philosophy, which was out there, back to the Socratic method and all those things. And there's some interesting things about and value in that Greek philosophy that was back there, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But that's what the attempt was, to get back to that, and so that's where this term came from, about the Middle Ages and Dark Ages. So, name the three most notable things that occurred during the Renaissance and the Reformation periods. If you had to think of the most important thing that happened during the Renaissance and Protestant Reformation, what would that be, Ken? The printing press. Man, oh man. A little piece of machinery, right? Boy, did it have wide-ranging impacts, and we'll talk about that. The second one, what was the second one? And I had never heard this term before studying for this class. Christian humanism. Now, there's a dichotomy in looking at that as how those terms are used today and in the 20th century. But we're going to talk about that too. A movement called Christian humanism. And what was the third one? Biggie. Protestant Reformation. Okay. Now remember, that is reformation, as opposed to restoration. All right? And we're not going to get into the restoration in this class, but there is a difference. Anyway, very, very different goals on that. Okay, so the Protestant Reformation. So let's talk about a little bit about how we got the printing press. This is kind of interesting. What do you need if you're gonna have a printing press? What do you need a lot of? Paper. Well, yeah, the wood and stuff to make the printing press, but you're going to build a machine. But paper, yeah, you need paper. So one of the things that's interesting, and again, the providence of God is all over this. The invention of the Chinese had already invented paper. Now, I'm not talking about the papyrus that the Egyptians had and the dead animal skins that the Europeans were able to come up with to write on, and the chiseling and all that kind of stuff. Now we're talking about paper, real paper stuff. And the Chinese had it back in 105. It didn't get imported, it kind of got imported with the silkworm and everything else. Marco Polo and those folks started bringing hijacked materials back from China. But it was first imported in 950. And notice, the first paper mill was not built in Spain till 1150. So we're talking about over 1,000 years it's taken for paper to make its way from China into Europe. But isn't it interesting? It just happened to show up about the same time as we were needing it. Again, if you can't see the providence of God in any of this, there was no grand plan in the life of humans to put all this together. So Johannes Gutenberg he operated the first printing press with movable type in 1452, and then in 1457, the first 42-line Bible, which was the Latin Vulgate. That was the Bible in Europe at that time. Now, what was the first thing? Was the 42-line Bible? It was the first book, but was it the first thing printed? Anybody know what the first thing printed was on the Gutenberg printing press? What's that? A papal indulgence. Figures, right? Yeah, exactly. That was what was the first thing. Okay, so we talked about the printing press. Printing press, lots of things associated with that. We're going to hit a few more things as we go along, but one of the things that the printing press did that it was interesting and not thought about much is the idea that it made it possible to kind of stabilize the languages out there, because all of a sudden, for the first time, you've got a lot of reading materials available. When you have a lot of reading materials available, you tend to get more people that want to read because there's material available. And so it's one of those happy little circumstances with the printing press that you get more books, you tend to get more readers. And the more readers you get, you have to stabilize the language, because it wouldn't be good to keep changing the letters, changing the words, every couple of days. It takes a lot. It took a whole day to just to put in the type print for one page. So it takes a lot to do that. All right, so the second thing was Christian humanism. And it spread across Europe, of course, 14th through the 16th centuries. It was very unlike humanism today. Humanism today, and in the 20th century, is all about the fact that there is no God. Man invented God. God did not create man. Man created God. And man is the center of all things. Now, that happily went along pretty good with what the Greeks loved, the idea of the beauty of the human body, and the humans being the top of the heap on everything. And we know there's some biblical truth to that when you compare it to the rest of creation. But the humanists take it to a spiritual level in this. That they would deny that there's a spiritual level to it. But so the Christian humanists basically had the idea that, in fact, God created man, but what is it that man can do with the talents and the abilities that God put in us? Now, that led to a whole different vector on thinking, because all of a sudden now man had value because God made you, and so now, since you have value, there are valuable things that you could do, and with training you can do them. And so all of that kind of started with this Christian humanist thinking on that. Question: what were three results of the Christian humanism movement? Okay, what are some of the things that this kind of thinking would have generated? And some of these are being brought back in a revisitation of our own education system today. This one in particular. Remember, they were in the Renaissance era, they were thinking back to classical Greek thinking and philosophy. And people like Socrates and Aristotle, great thinkers, the Romans, the Platos, and everything. What was the big brain thing that was going on with them? What was it that made them so special, and that they taught in their academies and everything? Okay, that would be the second one. But this first one is this idea of they were taught how to think. Deductive reasoning, thinking, how to think, how to go from idea to thought to action to all of that. And this is something that, again, when you talk about classical education, you're talking about these kinds of things. And these are things that are being thought of today to reinvigorate our own systems, for instance. The second one was the study of ancient Greek and Latin texts, okay, which led then to the third one, which is what Shirley brought up, which is this idea and desire to try to seek out the original texts when you're trying to translate something. And what a revolutionary idea that is. Because remember, with the Latin Vulgate, as much work as they did on that, if you remember back a couple weeks ago when we talked about it, it still ended up being a translation of a translation. Okay? But the idea here in this going back to the classical thinking was, if we're going to go back to the beginning, then let's go back to the beginning. And if we get to the beginning, we are going to be closer to the truth than any other place we can be. Because remember, we're talking about translations. That's the idea during this period of time. We're trying to get the word out to as many people as possible. So those are the three things associated with the Christian humanist movement. Very, very important things, especially the original source part. Okay. And the original source is the one that is going to get a lot of people in trouble with the Catholic Church as we go along here. So, how did the printing press and Christian humanism influence the translation of the Bible into English? Okay, so let's talk about the printing press first. Okay, all right. Well, the Gutenberg Bible, for instance, was the first book ever published, ever with a printing press. Okay. Now, how many could they publish?
It took a while, but
How much paper? The only limitation now is the paper, right? I mean, you could just print them. You could just print them. Keep going. Boom, boom, ba boom, ba boom, and away you go. And they did. Did you ever wonder why so many people learned how to read by reading the Bible? Well, think about all the books that were available back at this period of time. Not many. And there was no shortage of printing Bibles because they were books and people wanted them. All right. So, yeah, you could mass produce them. It was less expensive than hand-copied text for sure. And for the first time, in essence, technically you could provide the Bible to everybody. All you need to do is translate it so that they could read it. The translation then becomes the limiting factor for this. Just your ability to translate it into whatever language you're going to going to preach in, and away it goes. Well, before it was the physical ability to create a Bible and take one with you. So that's the printing press. The second one was the Christian humanism, and this one goes back to, again, the original sources. Seeking out original sources. So we're putting two things together. We're making so we've eliminated now the material problems associated with having Bibles available. All we got to do is translate them. And so, job one, translate them. How do we translate them? We go back to original sources, if we can. And that's the goal. Now, we're going to find out that there was a lot of shortcuts along the way that people either couldn't or wouldn't or didn't have time to go back to original sources. And some had original sources, some were translations of translations and things like that. And we'll look at those as we come through. And the process of putting the Bible into English had a massive amount of that involved. So there was a question, yeah, right there.
Well, you were just simplifying everything so much. It's not like everybody could read in English. The limit was on people's ability to read in general, and whatever was taught, usually in schools, like you mentioned, only clergy were allowed to learn. Well, the schools belonged to the monasteries and to the churches, so those people were educating the next generation, and obviously they were educating with their church material, but it was all in Latin because that was the language of the Bible at that time. So before you print hundreds of Bibles, you also need to teach people to read and write in English, and then do the printing press with all the English letters and all that stuff.
And you're going to see that became another problem. And Lena brings up a great point. That was the challenge that they were facing. It wasn't just a matter of printing Bibles. And no, we're going to have to go through all these processes. That when you talk about translating, what language were you going to translate it into? Well, we're talking about the English language tonight. But the English language was not the English language. England did not have an English language. The country of England, where the English language eventually rolled out of, is down the road here. And so we're gonna talk a little bit about that as we get down the road. There are some challenges associated with the language. Okay, so let's go. What contributions did Desiderius Erasmus and Robert Stephanus make to the accuracy of our current Bibles? Now remember, Desiderius Erasmus was this professor of Greek at Cambridge University. You remember what he was known for? Okay, he was one of these originalists that he wanted to go back to the original language to try to. Remember, we talked about the Latin Vulgate, and that there were so many different versions of the Latin Vulgate out there because everybody wanted to translate the Latin Vulgate on their own into a different language and a different language and all of these pieces. And they finally, the Pope said, enough of this. We're going to get you all together and we're going to create a version of it. And that, yeah, exactly. So it's similar to that situation. So he was an originalist. What he created in 1516 through 1518 there was this a published side-by-side. This is the first time that there was a published side-by-side where he had the Greek New Testament, the Koine Greek, next to the Latin on the page of the Bible itself. So it's like an open Bible or one of your study Bibles, like this, where they had them just lined up so that you could look at it. And of course, then he got so good at the Latin as a Greek scholar and everything that he just decided to go ahead and do his own version of the Latin Vulgate for the Old Testament, and so he had a lot that he was doing, and there were a lot of people that were disciples of his, let's say, and we're going to run into some of those. Then there was Robert Stephanus, who was a direct disciple. What was he most used for that we could thank him for today? Yeah, he's the guy that came up with the chapter and verse format for this. So thank you very much. Otherwise, hey, Ken, read this one for me. It's halfway down the second page of, I don't know what this section is, but it's kind of, yeah. No, we've got Genesis chapter 2, verse 15 because of Robert Stephanus. So we can thank him for that. All right. And anything that was known, his works, the works that were associated with him, were called the Textus Receptus, which means the received text, which means that this was the official stuff. Okay, if it was Textus Receptus, it's the good stuff. All right, and you can count on this. At least it got the official stamp of approval. So, all right, so let's talk about the Protestant Reformation then. And who started the Reformation movement? And what was he protesting against? Right, Martin Luther, 1517. Okay, what was he protesting against? In general, the Catholic Church. But specifically, what was he protesting against? Or what was he wanted to do? You can use, those are two different things, but.
The church's practice of selling those indulgences.
Selling those indulgences. All right, remember the first thing that came off the press? That was what Martin Luther was upset about, okay, those indulgences. And so, what's that? The indulgences? Literally, the indulgences were the, how many of you know about the Catholic concept of purgatory? Okay, a couple, anybody from the East Coast. But anyway, you could literally buy a deceased relative out of purgatory and get rid of their sins by paying a certain amount of money for the sins. Or if you want to get ahead of the game, you can kind of pay for your sins now, as you're going along. If you got some, moolah in the back pocket there, little coins in the realm. And so this is what it was. And of course, it all went into the coffers of the Catholic Church, and money is power, and that's how they managed to keep all this going. It was a big scam. So they challenged this his practice of indulgences, and the original intent was he didn't want to get rid of the Catholic Church. He just wanted to reform it so that it wouldn't do these bad things anymore, okay? But the problem was, once you let the genie out of the bottle a little bit, it tends to just kind of get momentum on its own. And that's what happened with this. Ultimately, it led to not a reformation of the Catholic Church, but it turned into a rejection of the Catholic Church throughout Europe, all over the place. And so it just got a lot of people upset. Remember, the Catholics had a lot of power, and the Pope had a lot of power during this period of time. So that was not, you got a lot of money and you got a lot of power. You are not just going to say, some monk up in Germany, posted some stuff on a door, and, he cut his head off, and who else have I got, that I can go down? So these are things that are going to cause some problems. But Luther's Reformation motto is kind of interesting, especially finding out, where he ended up with some of his scriptural topics, was sola scriptura, which was the scriptures alone. He believed that. Yeah, his interpretation of those same scriptures kind of changed over the years and caused some problems, but that was the right place to start. And of course, we're familiar with 2 Timothy 3, verses 15 through 17, and Ephesians 3 and 4, and would agree with Martin Luther on this point, one point. All right, so we head right into the next lesson on the Bible into English, since we're we are just moving right along here on that. Okay, so let's talk about Anglo-Saxon England. Now we're going to get into some of the areas that Lena was talking about. What was Anglo-Saxon England like? And I'm going to say there was no England at the time, but when I say England, all I'm talking about is a section of about 6 to 8 duchies in the middle of Great Britain, or the Britons, or Britannia from the Roman side. So there were some good kings that tried to unify into a united England at the time. King Alfred was one of them. If you ever saw, there's a show on TV called The Last Kingdom, and it's about this period of time when Alfred lived, and it talks about the Viking invasions and all that kind of stuff, and it's this exact period of time. There were some translation attempts to translate biblical things into languages that the people living in Britannia could speak, okay, but they were pieces of the Bible and little sections like Exodus, Psalms, Acts. These were sections that were translated. There were Bible stories that were translated into various sections of English and everything. But there's no manuscripts that ever survived this period. The fact was, during the Anglo-Saxon, prior to the Norman invasion, basically religion was mainly centered around Catholic policy in Britannia. It was still that way. And any translation attempts that were, these translation, when they were trying to get some translations going, when a king would start to step up and try to do something, basically, there were problems that were going on within the English culture and within the English language that made it near impossible for them to try to get some kind of widespread translations. If you look at the culture, for instance, in 1066, the Normans, which were not me, but the guys over in Normandy, over on the French coast, William the Conqueror, he invaded England, and the French thought that they were going to take over England and get rid of the Anglo-Saxon culture and everything. Ha ha, laugh on them. They ended up being assimilated into the Anglo-Saxon culture, and kind of the only thing you see of them nowadays is occasionally you'll see a Brit that has a French name. but they got assimilated, like the cube. But the language was a real problem. During this period of time, they called it Middle English. And they called it Middle English because it was between what we know today and the gibberish that was going on back in the first 1,000 years. So basically, there were significant changes in vocabulary, grammar, punctuation. All of that was going on during this 500-year period. And so any attempts at translations and stuff were really problems. But with the invention of the printing press, gets back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the class. The printing press enabled it to stabilize the language for the first time. And because they were printing a lot of it. And Middle English, if you ever want to see what Middle English looks like, and J.R.R. Tolkien was a great, the guy who did Lord of the Rings and stuff. He was a great Middle English scholar, and a lot of his things that he got for that was associated with Middle English mythology and everything. But if you want to see what something looks like in Middle English, Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. We had to do it in high school. If you guys want to see some Middle English, it's rough. Or Beowulf. Beowulf's another good one that you could look at for it. Okay, so we're going to meet this guy, all right, starting 2 weeks from now. John Wycliffe, very interesting individual, and somebody that we can be very thankful, those of us that read English Bibles today, can be very thankful to this guy, because he really got things started for us. So, okay, thanks, guys.